Joining us now is Stephen A. Cook. He's a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Steve, thanks a million for doing this. How you doing?
It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure, Michael. Great to be on with you as always.
As always, my friend. We're going to do, as we're wont to do, a sort of broader regional tour of MENA. We're going to touch specifically on Saudi Arabia. Well, that's the region you picked, my friend.
Right.
I didn't force your hand. You could have been doing much more fun things as an undergraduate, I'm sure. I studied a lot of it too.
This was fun.
Right. Was it fun getting a PhD?
It was, actually. It was a lot of fun. It was a blast. I mean, people struggle through it, and I had my moments. But, of course, getting the opportunity to go and kind of live abroad for a period of time and delve into intellectual questions that fascinate you, what could be bad, right?
Well, I guess until, Donald Trump is president, Erdogan's president. MBS runs the Saudi monarchy.
Right.
El-Sisi is in Egypt. Netanyahu's in Israel. I don't know. I'm ticking the boxes here.
In one sense, that is interesting. In another sense, it's deeply and profoundly depressing, which is why I said, do we really have to? But let's go. Let's talk about it all.
Well, as people will know from listening to I don't know if you want me to plug this, but I listen to the Amen Quarter podcast that you do with our friend Brad. And people know that actually Steve is quite capable of talking about a lot more than MENA.
This is true. Thanks for plugging me on Men Corner. It's a lot of fun to do with our buddy Brad Rothschild. We go a little less on the Middle East politics and more on the just general politics and pop culture stuff.
That's more, that's the hey, why aren't there bands like The Clash or Public Enemy anymore? What happened to Gefilte Fish at Zabar's isn't as good anymore. And my God, is Ted Cruz an asshole?
There you go.
It's a great show.
Thanks, buddy.
Oh, no, for real. I want to talk. I mean, we did the opening segment on the House's just this unbelievable moral failure to pass the Ro Khanna bill to stop funding the Saudi-UAE war on Yemen, which, we could keep spelling out is really one of the greatest, humanitarian abuses and crises in the world today. Paul Ryan stuck it into a farm bill in this incredibly cynical parliamentary maneuver. 18 Republicans actually crossed sides to vote the right way, and 5 Democrats crossed sides to vote the wrong way. And then, of course, there's the Sanders-Murphy-Lee bill in the Senate.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And in some ways, we'll get to Khashoggi soon, but there is the sort of, there's all the terrifying implications of the Khashoggi murder, but there is, I think, the very fair point that, this has been going on since 2015 with U.S. support, and it's an undeniable just sort of mass crime against humanity. In spite of the setback, is the politics of it shifting in D.C. with a kind of broader frustration, even disgust with Saudi Arabia?
I'd like to say that it is, but I'm not convinced that it will be.
Yeah.
I think, look, there's tremendous amount of moral outrage over the Khashoggi murder, which has in turn focused more people's attention on Yemen. But as you quite rightly point out, where were people in 2015? Quite honestly, where were people in 2006 when this cataclysm really began? So, the Saudis have only been there for 3 years or so, but it's been going on for quite some time. And we have, as you point out, been supporting it. I think the Obama administration took a look at this and said, well, we are negotiating with the Iranians, and this has freaked out our allies in the Gulf. So what can we do to reassure them that we're on their side in helping to ensure their security? And of course, we picked Yemen. Right. Yemen. Right. This is craziness. An argument can be made that you have to have a robust approach to Al-Qaeda of the Arabian Peninsula in Yemen, which is, deeply embedded in that country and a threat. But to enable the Saudis in their kind of ill-fated intervention, which at the outset of it, when they said what they were fighting for, and they basically said this, that they were fighting to prevent the Hezbollahization of Yemen and to ensure that the Iranians didn't get a toehold in the Arabian Peninsula. And you looked at what they were doing and said, well, this is all going to become a self-fulfilling prophecy that you're never going to be able to get out of. And of course, that's what's come to pass. And in the crossfire have been millions of Yemenis who are on the verge of starvation. There's cholera. It's terrible. And then, of course, so that was the Obama administration, long wind up the Obama administration's thing on. And then the Trump administration comes into office and who have this kind of, single-minded focus on confronting the Iranians, and that the focal point of their policy is going to be Saudi Arabia. And in particular, they're going to put Jared Kushner in charge of handling the relationship with Saudi Arabia because he's a 30-something, and so is the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman. It's just bizarre in the extreme that only has made things worse. Because of what it did, it signaled to the Saudis that they can get around the formal foreign policy process, go directly to the son-in-law, go directly to the president, who really doesn't know much about anything, as we all know. I mean, but the level of the president's ignorance upon coming to office is actually greater than many people suspect. So this is how we got there.
So do you think, and I want to just do a real, realist, no sort of, moral judgment about the Houthis one way or another, but it does strike me that even that the Saudi foreign policy of assuming that the Houthis are just a sort of a Yemeni Hezbollah, you said Hezbollahization, and Hezbollah is an organic group to Lebanon, but it's definitely it's I don't know if it's exactly an Iranian proxy, but the power and capacity of Hezbollah is dependent and reciprocal to the Iranian government. And so that is maybe fair to look at Hezbollah and say you can't understand Hezbollah without understanding the Islamic Republic. And the Houthis, in my read, are a far more, yes, they're Shia, but they are an organic group to Yemen, whatever you think of them one way or another. And yes, they've taken some support from Iran, sure, but plenty of groups take, plenty of support from various state actors. It doesn't mean that they are a creation of them. And it seems, right? So I guess, would you explain the Houthis on that axis of like organic to a place versus a proxy?
So the Saudis have been in conflict with this group that we now refer to as the Houthis for decades. I mean, going back to, the 1930s. The Houthis are actually named after a guy named Hussein al-Houthi, who raised this militia and that was based around the solidarity of a sect of Shiism called they are what's called Zaydis. They are Shia, but they don't believe the same things that the Iranian Shia. They're not 12 or Shia. Not necessary to get into all the details of this, but so this has been a conflict that's been ongoing. Of course, the Saudis supported them during a previous Yemeni civil war in the 1960s, but it has been a conflictual relationship. Hussein al-Houthi had, a variety of worldviews that we would find to be, unpleasant. He was a 9/11 truther. He took up the Iranian Revolutionary Creed, death to America, death to the Jews, victory for Islam. But the worldview is sort of a mishmash of kind of Islamic State, things that are kind of indigenous to Houthi thinking. But the conflict in Yemen began as a conflict between the Houthis and the central government. And that was also a long-running conflict. The Saudis, from their perspective, the gains that the Houthi militia, now Houthi army, made in forcing the legitimate government, not necessarily popular, but legitimate government out of Sana'a, was to them how could the Houthis possibly do this? There must be an Iranian hand in it, and it's much of what the Saudis see around them, they perceive to be an Iranian hand at work. But you're spot on. This is a group that is indigenous. Their conflicts within Yemen are local conflicts. And when the Saudis threw their forces into Yemen in 2015, they had done it actually once before in 2009, committed ground troops and kind of got their butts handed to them, and they retreated. So now it's just been primarily an air campaign. The Iranians used the opportunity to support the Houthis. So if you look at it really from a geopolitical perspective, here you have the Saudis who are spending millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars on this quagmire. And the Iranians need to spend very, very little, and the Houthis only really have to fight the Saudis to a standstill to win. And that's precisely what's happened. And they have driven the Houthis closer to the Iranians, but that's
right.
not the way it started, and that's not the way it had to be.
Right. So we're going to get to MBS in a second, but I do just want to touch. So the other dynamic here about Yemen, so it's one thing to say, yes, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and the presence in Yemen was, absolutely real, and definitely, I don't know. I mean, I'm pretty skeptical, I have to say, mostly of sort of like the capacity of these groups to steadily and consistently threaten the United States, in terms of on the U.S. homeland in any type of systemic way. But there's no doubt that whether it's, but even as an example, the attacks that Al Qaeda started with in the late '90s, like embassy attacks, and things like that, right? Like those are those are very serious, very harmful terrorist attacks that sort of initially gave them their legs. It's one thing to recognize that it's a real threat and a real operative organization, and also, but it does not mean obviously that we endorse the drone policy there, which was very destructive to Yemen.
Right.
So,
right.
What's the dynamic between, on one hand, you have this sort of weird dual approach, where on one hand, okay, there's an actual problem there, but let's just outsource it to drone warfare, which kills a lot of civilians and it causes instability. I think that's been very documented, including even by military sources. I don't think this is a controversial opinion at all at this point. And then conversely, to say, oh, the real issue is the Saudi UAE perception of Yemen, and that's all about Iran. And we certainly know how the Saudis can be quite willing to support, rather right-wing Salafist groups in their proxy war. So how does the U.S., I mean, both approaches are pretty disastrous, but how does that square get circled here?
Well, and this is really, in Yemen, you have a number of different conflicts that are all going on at one time.
Right.
And what really focused the American attention on Yemen was, in fact, the underwear bomber. The underwear bomber was the guy who came, he was sent by AQAP. The intention was to blow up a flight en route to Detroit on Christmas Day, and I can't even remember the year. We've been at this
was it
for so long.
2009?
I feel like it was 2000, and sometime between 2006 and 2009. I cannot remember. Maybe 2006 was the guy with the shoe bomber guy.
Yeah.
Regardless, it was really that threat, and people sort of woke up to the fact that although the United States had dealt this extraordinary blow to Al-Qaeda Central in Afghanistan, that there were these kind of affiliate organizations essentially out there operating on their own, and that Al-Qaeda of the Arabian Peninsula was a particularly potent one, and that it certainly had the means to try to put on these spectacular attacks. And I think that's what the drone warfare began. And then, of course, the Obama administration really ramped it up. It was a way of Obama proving that he was going to be tough in regard to American security, but without having to deploy American forces all over the world, which was, the theory of his 2008 run for office. We're not going to do stupid stuff, but I think his quote was, "I won't be afraid to pull the trigger."
Right.
So you've got that, and then the Emiratis are interesting because, in fact, their primary focus in Yemen had been AQAP. They saw AQAP, Al-Qaeda of the Arabian Peninsula, as a significant threat to them. And they were kind of in these hit and run type military operations against AQAP, sometimes in cooperation with the United States, sometimes on their own. And then the Saudis launched into Yemen, and the Emiratis actually got really nervous, believing that the Saudis wouldn't win and that it would destabilize the Arabian Peninsula. So they decided they needed to support the Saudis there. But they do that primarily through their own Yemeni proxies. And of course, there are conflicts between these different groups and AQAP as well as ISIS. So one can imagine, in some weird way, there is actually, Houthis don't like ISIS. The United States doesn't like ISIS. No one likes ISIS. But of course, the Iranian issue overrides everything for the Saudis. And it's very, very important for the Emiratis. And as the junior partner to the Saudis, they want to be supportive of the Saudis.
And I just always like to mention, I was obviously big critic of Obama's drone policy and just the sort of structure of drone policy in general. But for those who would draw false equivalencies, drone strikes have actually up-tempoed under Trump, and there's clearly, any type of systemic analysis to try to minimize civilian casualties is totally out the window in the Trump era.
Well, that's what I mean. From the very beginning, from the first weeks of the Trump presidency, he basically said, "I'm unleashing the military to do whatever it is that they want to do." At least in the Obama administration, there was, you wanted to do these things, it had to go all the way up to the White House for them to get the go-ahead to undertake some of these drone strikes.
Right. That's just really important to underline, I think, and in a way that justifies neither, but makes very clear legal and moral distinctions. So MBS is I found
where do we begin?
Yeah, I always thought this whole branding of MBS was ludicrous. Watching him get a Starbucks with Mike Bloomberg was one of the more. It's like a Venn diagram of almost everything I don't like in politics. So, how easy was it in a way that is very not compliment? Let me frame it this way. There's obviously major human rights issues in Saudi Arabia. And most people are aware of them. Everything from, the more sort of, executing Shia civil rights activists. People have no connection to any kind of violence, but have merely spoken out around, sort of civil space to the extent that exists in Saudi Arabia. To, of course, very extreme forms of gender segregation. It seemed
apartheid.
Gender apartheid, 100%. Thank you. Gender apartheid. It seemed to me, and correct me if I'm being too cynical here, that one of the reasons that MBS was able to get so much currency was because he was playing on a very narcissistic conversation in the United States, which is that we would swoop in and find these extreme examples, all of which were true, but not do any systemic analysis around them. So, oh my God, can you believe women can't drive there? Well, that's obviously appalling, and there's no, and that's not because of Islam or anything. That's a human rights abuse. That's a decision made in a Saudi context. And he did these things like give women the right to drive, make some nice noises about promoting a different sort of flavor of Islam, and instead of looking at it and saying, well, wait a second, he's also actually imprisoning these women activists at the same time. And he's saying to the kingdom, this is a gift from me. And it's not like a reform in the sense of we're going to have a little bit more of a accountable to the polity. It's just that I'm an enlightened young prince and you're going to thank me for this. That the Western press and media was so lost in their own projections of, privatizing the oil industry in Saudi Arabia, or even these things that they're right about, like the need for women to drive, but not looking into more systemic questions about how power actually works there, that this guy was able to make a splashy good impression here really very easily, even as who he is was already even reported in a place like the New Yorker by Dexter Filkins, right? Like you didn't have to search that far and wide.
Right. I think that's fairly close to what it has happened. But I will point out it's not just a function of MBS and him being the young prince. Every Saudi ruler who has come to power, the New York Times has declared to be a reformer. King Abdullah was declared a reformer. Before him, Fahd was declared a reformer. Faisal was declared a reformer. All these people have been declared by the newspapers of record in the West to be reformers. With Mohammed bin Salman, I think it was accentuated because when he came to power, and of course he's not the king yet, but we know that he will be. But when he came to power, he wasn't already half dead. Like many of the other Saudi leaders. He pressed every button that there was. Allowing women to drive, providing opportunity for women to be in the workforce more openly, theaters, sporting events, reining in the religious police was perhaps the most important thing for him to do. That was deeply appealing to people looking at Saudi Arabia from the West, or among Saudis themselves, that they deeply hated religious police. These things were intended to build a domestic constituency for Mohammed bin Salman, so that when he did try to take on those within the royal family who were opposed to his rise and opposed to his plans, he would have this reservoir of support. And I'll tell you, I spent 2 weeks in Saudi Arabia around this time last year, and I purposely avoided talking to elites about Mohammed bin Salman. In fact, there were virtually no elites on my itinerary. And kind of the powerless Saudis really did have high hopes for him. Now, you could say, well, look, Saudis like their leaders and so on and so forth. I'd like to give Saudis a little more credit than that. So I think that they did think that there was something new here. I think things that have happened since that time, one can imagine people are questioning all the wisdom of the crown prince. And I will say, even at that time, people did question the wisdom of being at war in Yemen, given the real tight connections between those two countries. But you're quite right when it comes to the West. I mean, he was in the United States in March, April of 2018, and he was received like a rock star, and it was, quite frankly, it was bizarre. Given who he is, given the fact that even his grand plan for reform, first of all, big parts of this were nothing new. I'm old enough that I remember two previous grand plans for reform in Saudi Arabia. Second, what he was trying to do was, deeply destabilizing to Saudi Arabia. And I think people kind of lost sight of it because, he's outward looking. Meanwhile, this is a guy who'd never really been outside of Saudi Arabia. And that's one of the reasons why he was the anointed one by his father, who was the family enforcer. And we know that apples don't fall that far from the tree, even if the sun is deny it. So, I think it's a big, kind of, as much as there's been, as the Secretary of State has said, there's been a media pile-on now to be critical of Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia. I think at the time there was this kind of media kind of exhilaration around this guy and what he was likely, or what they imputed to him, what he might do.
Right, and I think, and I really underline just the total omission of the grassroots energy of things like women's rights activists in Saudi Arabia that were totally obscured in that conversation.
Right.
Like, oh my God, look at how cool this guy is. That and of course that it fits into a much longer pattern, as you said, of these relationships. And that was that's another funding source of Tony Blair's institute that's been revealed recently. Like, some of this stuff is just
right. There is that aspect of it as well. Right, of course.
What though? Okay, so your piece in Foreign Policy, Mohammed bin Salman is worse than a criminal. He's a symbol. You're focusing in that piece though about how and set it up for us in terms of the Khashoggi murder and the bigger fault lines that's starting to open up. And you can talk about that, but then we'll pivot to the interference being run by for him by Kushner, Trump, and Pompeo.
Right. Well, I've been writing about the Saudis quite a bit, not just as a result of the Khashoggi murder, but my real kind of uptick in writing about Saudis, it started actually with his emergence and his Vision 2030, but really over the summer, before Khashoggi was murdered, the freak out over Canada was something that fascinated me. Like, why, if this guy is such a reformer and he's so forward leaning and he's changing the culture in Saudi Arabia, would he be freaking out about some mild criticism from Canada? And I think it really reveals what he and his entourage were like. That obviously we didn't know at the time that he freaked out at Canada. At the time he was freaking out at Canada over a tweet that he was actually targeting Jamal Khashoggi and others like him. And the Saudis, it's really interesting. They have been, when you listen to them, when you listen to Saudis in the United States, they have a completely opposite perspective on the way in which Mohammed bin Salman was received initially in the United States. They think he's never gotten any good press. The Saudis never get a break. Wow. They're such good allies. They're criticized relentlessly. And then this only proves the murder of Khashoggi and what Secretary Pompeo called caterwauling on the Hill, and as I said before, a media pylon. This just proves that the American elite, the media, is reflexively opposed to Saudi Arabia. And so this piece was really actually focused on explaining to Saudis why Americans would be so outraged over the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, especially since, how many people knew the name Jamal Khashoggi before October 2nd, 2018? But as I point out, the place I go and pick up my bagel, these guys, they're like, what's up with the Khashoggi thing?
Right.
My mom's bridge club. And people they recoil at this. And so the point of the piece was to say, it's not caterwauling. It's not a media pylon. There are some real issues at stake here, and that's the symbol part. So, I pointed out first, there is even though there's bipartisan support for some of the stuff going on Capitol Hill, there is a partisan effort given the close connection between the Trump family and Mohammed bin Salman. Second, look, this is unfinished business related to 9/11. I think it's undeniable that people have done sweeping really bad Saudi behavior under the rug. And the fact that, the Saudis got really angry at me for bringing this up. But my answer to them is, look, if there are parts of the 9/11 report that have not been made public, and they have not been made public in large part because you don't want it to make public, it raises suspicions about what your actual role was in those attacks. And then I think the other things are, Mohammed bin Salman has come to symbolize a world that is out of control. Look, if you are a journalist these days, and I'm tempted to say if you're an international correspondent, but of course there's a connection to domestic politics here, you have to live in abject terror of what might happen to you if you cross somebody's red line that you have no idea that you've crossed their red line. Even for someone like myself, an analyst with an academic training, to go abroad these days is a very scary prospect. So it's a world where there are no norms, things are out of control, and Mohammed bin Salman has come to really symbolize that. And again, I was trying to explain this to Saudis, and just the onslaught of criticism that I've gotten from Saudis for trying to explain to them American outrage over what happened. It's really,
honestly,
really hard.
Okay, so that kind of blows my mind. I mean, I have some bigger questions about it, but like, whatever one thinks of the Saudis, and obviously we're talking essentially about their elites, their leadership, not everyday Saudis. But like, even if you're a very fierce critic of the Saudi monarchy, which kind of, I mean, I am. I guess what I'm saying is the fact that it never, I mean, these people are still in general very sophisticated, very capable of operating in a lot of different contexts. they didn't think that abducting a Washington Post journalist and hacking him alive with a bone saw would freak people out. I mean, even if they calculated correctly that the Trump administration would cover for them, which is the accurate assessment, they didn't think that this, I mean, I mean, that actually is awe-inspiring that they didn't think that this would bother people and freak people out.
I think that it's a function of a couple of things. One, and they're connected. And this may sound banal, but the Saudis haven't had an effective ambassador in Washington D.C. in 3 or 4 years since the now foreign minister Al Jubeir departed. So there's no real flow of information about the way in which Washington works in going to Riyadh. Secondly, Mohammed bin Salman, not worldly, unlike a lot of other Saudi elites, was not educated abroad. The people around him, his closest advisors, the same thing. And they have become insulated by their own kind of view of the world that is impenetrable. And so, he's a journalist. He has offended the Saudi Arabia and offended its leader. And this is the way they were going to go about handling it. And I think, from all reports, I'm, I think one of the few Washington, D.C. Middle East analysts who's actually never met Mohammed bin Salman. But all reports are that he's been stunned by the reaction, which is absolutely, as you point out, absolutely stunning. That there, not only in the stupidity of this operation, but just the idea that, we can murder a journalist and it would go unnoticed. I think that happens a lot, but a number of things have come together to make it a focal point for the way in which for the world that we live in, and a focal point for Americans who are tired, as I said before, of sweeping bad Saudi behavior under the rug. I think they're totally unaware. Think of everything that we've learned about Mohammed bin Salman and his advisors since the Khashoggi story broke. These guys are isolated. They look at the world. They have this kind of, in this puffed up way, Saudi Arabia is as important as, look, the Russians get away with stuff, the Turks get away with stuff, the Israelis get away with stuff. Right. They are killing people. We're going to eliminate our enemies as well. Without understanding, one, they're not those countries. Two, there are nuances and complexities of their position in the world that makes it that runs against their analysis that they could get away with it like those other countries.
I mean, I'm all for the project of Khashoggi should be a door to a much wider critique. Why? Okay, I think it's a totally valid criticism. Lindsey Graham has a big meltdown about Khashoggi, but has been until very recently very supportive of any kind of Saudi atrocity possible. Right. There's a whole larger set of questions that are valid and vital and important. And then conversely, people that want to minimize the resetting of the template of what is acceptable and the new dangers that it opens, that, of abducting a journalist like that. I mean, I think of, the closest I could think of was when the, U.S.-backed Chilean regime in the 70s planted a car bomb on a former diplomat in D.C. And certainly Kissinger helped cover it up for him. That's a matter of public record. But I also have no doubt that there were back channels that said, hey, we're going to run interference while you guys kill a ton of people in Chile, but you can't bring that here. Now, obviously, I don't want either thing to happen, but it's still a vast escalation, or not a moral vast escalation, but a escalation in terms of where and of extremes you're operating in and conventions you're overturning to do something like take a Washington Post columnist in a Istanbul embassy and cut him alive with a hacksaw. I mean, it's just, I can't. I'm genuinely stunned because I don't think of the Saudis as dumb, right? Like I have problems, but I don't think of them as stupid. Yeah.
So and look, as soon as Jamal Khashoggi went missing, I kind of reached out to friends in Saudi and in the Gulf. And I said, what's going on? I said, we can't imagine what's going on, but we know the Saudis aren't this stupid to have done this.
Right.
And so no one could imagine that. And so this was, again, it's a new leadership. And, defenders, people who wanted to go away, who wanted to sweep it on the rug, say, well, he's young, he's inexperienced. And so, come on. I mean,
he's like, the drugs you did. That's not, right. He's young, he's inexperienced. Exactly. He ordered a journalist to be hacked alive.
Right. That's like what, that was like the excuse, I was trying to defend myself like when I took the car out when I was 15. Well, I'm young, I'm inexperienced, Right. This guy's out getting having journalists eliminated.
This is the large adult son phenomenon.
Large adult son phenomenon, right? Exactly.
So it is stunning that they think that when they did it, that they think they could get away with it, and that they are offended by the outrage associated with it. And of course, you do have the Trump administration running heavy interference.
Well, I want to get to that in